What is the current stage of human rights in China, and comparing also to a few years ago?
I would say that one really large factor in the current state of Chinese human rights is that the space for non-governmental speakers, so the Chinese civic space, has shrunk a lot, and that a lot of the topics or specialists who thought they were speaking non-politically, including the healthcare workers that were discussing, sometimes in private, the disease that turned out to be COVID-19, they suddenly realized when they were disciplined that their speech was politically sensitive, and the implications of this information, whether it was people reporting on it or people discussing them, a lot of issues can turn into human rights issues in terms of political sensitivity and in state response.
Human rights violation has been happening in China constantly, but what has changed in the last few years?
Well, under Xi Jinping, we have watched the government, among other things, commit crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic communities in the western part of the country. These are some of the most serious violations that exist under international human rights law. But we've also seen rollbacks on issues ranging from women's rights to the rule of law. We've watched the authorities work quite assiduously to stamp out independent civil society. And we've watched the authorities step up their assaults against human rights beyond China's borders, too, whether it's threats to academic freedom and democracies, labor rights around the world, or indeed even threats to the international human rights system. We're now operating on all of these different levels to try to protect human rights defenders and keep a little bit of space open for activism.
Considering China's human rights record and growing international influence, what are possible implications for institutions as the UN?
There are a number of reasons why we believe it should be an urgent priority for democracies to press for investigations into crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs, meaning crimes committed by the Chinese government, at a body like the UN. Is, first of all, that's what international law requires, and it's what victims need. And it's what we see governments do in other situations around the world. But we also see it as a way of strengthening the UN human rights system against Chinese government pressure to hold all states accountable, no matter how big or how small, how powerful or not. This is an institution that has come under significant pressure from the Chinese government in recent years. It's a very Byzantine system. I think it's hard for democracies to figure out how to protect those spaces. And they're less vested in how those spaces work because they have functioning institutions in their own home countries. And we often get asked, the UN human rights system, it's so corrupted, it doesn't deliver, does it really matter? Can it be saved from Chinese government pressure? And to that, we say what our Chinese counterparts say to us. Chinese human rights defenders themselves, or human rights defenders from across China, will say that they care about those institutions. It's where they can try to take complaints about torture or children's rights violations or to find family members who've been forcibly disappeared. They believe that it's the system that should work for them. And in that sense, we as an organization believe that it needs to be protected and strengthened, and that holding the Chinese government accountable for these crimes is an essential part of that project.
A new law in Germany and also soon in the EU demands protection of human rights in global supply chains. But how can German and EU companies really ensure this when dealing with China?
Well, they have to, as they've on some level been obliged to do for some time now, ask hard questions about how their products were made, where they were made, by whom they were made, what the labor conditions were. In 2011, the United Nations adopted the guiding principles on business and human rights that set out the standards for human rights due diligence. And that essentially obliges companies to know how their products were made. And if they find problems, there's a positive obligation to remedy those, to pay workers, for example, or to mitigate environmental problems in the production of goods. These are just a few examples. But for too long, companies have essentially brushed this aside or only fulfilled these obligations in very superficial ways. The new law that went into effect in the United States last year, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, actually puts the obligation on companies to show that their goods made in the Uyghur region or by Uyghur labor in other parts of the country was not made by forced labor. And it's early days. It's only been about 9 months since this has been in effect. And so the implementation of this law needs some refining. But I think it's a way of a government saying to companies, it's on you to fulfill these obligations and to show us that you've done that. And I think that will probably prove over time to have helped eliminate forced labor-made goods from supply chains around the world. So those are, I think, some of the tools that governments can use to push back against these kinds of problems. You reported in China for years, right? We all know that forced labor or prison-made goods has been an irritant, a real problem, a serious human rights violation inside the country for decades now. And we're only just getting around to adopting and using tools to really try to solve that problem, I think.
Protection of human rights in global supply chains. And the question is, I don't know if America has something similar on China, but the question is, how can German and EU companies really ensure this when dealing with China?
Well, inspections of Chinese supply chains happen at the discretion of local government. And also one thing in manufacturing particularly is sometimes manufacturing runs can be shifted so that goods that might be produced maybe less ethically are done for the domestic market because most of the muscle that foreign governments can really flex are goods that are made for export to foreign states, but they really can't do as much for the domestic Chinese market. And to a certain extent, China's domestic market kind of powers itself. It is, to a certain degree, self-sufficient, but it is still a net importer of certain goods, such as agriculture.
But if these foreign companies cannot control this, from a human rights perspective, should that mean these companies should stop doing business with China?
Like a trade embargo?
Yes, something.
They can, but not without cost. And given the nature of companies, the cost that likely passes down to consumers and also to political implications for their home countries. Because at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And what I mean by that is governments need to know what they are willing to give up in terms of how they consume, how they produce certain types of products, because whatever they decide on China, it's going to change the way that their economies function. And so we're really at a point where governments have to decide, what do you actually prioritize? And what are you willing to maybe give up to make the changes that you want to make?
But when these businesses or these companies cannot ensure that there hasn't been any violations, what does that mean?
It's time to go.
Okay.
It's time to go.